O.G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about the most rational and suboptimal of all possible worlds on Existential Monday by Benjamin Fondane. I had the pleasure of a reading group with David Gosley and John David recently on Benjamin Fondane. He's an example of one of those thinkers you didn't know about, and after you encounter, you're mystified by the fact you went so many years not even knowing his name. I think he's a very valuable existential philosopher that also illuminates some of the thoughts that the Truism and the Rational trilogy discusses at length, which is the pitfalls of autonomous rationality, the dangers of a dichotomy where you're stuck between rational or irrational, and how that doesn't make room for non-rationality, and the unintentional consequences that come from that. A question that can be asked that is riffing off of Leibniz: would the best of all possible worlds be the most rational of all possible worlds? By this, I mean a world where only rational action occurred, that there was nothing that wasn't rational. Would this be the best of all possible worlds? Well, if we believe in God, and God made a world where irrationality is possible, or action which is not rationally based, well, Leibniz might be suggesting then that, therefore, action of which isn't purely rational might be necessary for the best of all possible worlds. And if we follow Benjamin Fondane, in fact, a world where there was only rationality would be a totalitarian regime. I think Mr. Fondane in his work will talk about irrationality, and he's defending irrationality, but really I think it's important to think of non-rationality, a third category. I think when we only have the language of rationality and irrationality, then we assume that if it's not rational, it is irrational, and therefore we don't do it. But this is very, very problematic because there's lots of non-rational action. And non-rational action very often are the freest, most autonomous, most human of decisions that we can make. How do you rationally decide who you love or who you're going to marry? How do you rationally decide what you're going to do with your life? How do you rationally approach life in general? My mind can never fully grasp this object that is a cup. I'm always dealing with abstractions, and yet that doesn't mean those abstractions aren't useful, but there's always a degree of approximation and therefore incompleteness embedded in my very approach to the world. This is where non-rationality comes in. I discuss this with Lorenzo, discuss it extensively in the Truism of the Rational, and Mr. Fondane is another example of someone who is adamant that autonomous rationality, to use that language from David Hume that I think is so important, leads to totalitarianism. Another way to think of autonomous rationality is just A is A thinking. If there is A is A thinking and everything has to conform to that, well, if there is something that is human that cannot be ultimately modeled, that cannot be fit into an AA schema, well, then AA has to become a force of violence. Everything has to be confronted with violence to fit into A is A, and that's very problematic. To frame this question another way, there's this movie called Looper by Rian Johnson. I think it's a cool movie. I really like it. But it arguably has some very large plot holes. It can't be completely justified. I'm not saying that it's like they're awful plot holes, but there are certain plot holes that are there, that are, I think, in the script. Likewise, say the paintings of Dali. I'm not sure if there's always a meaning to the painting. Sometimes the meaning is the image. And the question is the following: would the world be better off if Looper didn't exist, if the paintings of Dali didn't exist, and all of the art that ultimately lacks rational justification? Would the world really be better if these things didn't exist? If we answer no, then that would be to Fondane's point that irrationality or non-rationality is very, very important. Now, again, I'm not saying that a movie like maybe some of the Dali painting, maybe 40% of Dali's paintings have meaning, or 40% of a single painting has meaning, but the other 60% does not. I'm not saying that there's meaning to justify everything, or it's like entirely one or the other. But the idea is that there's probably a whole lot of art, music, stuff like that wouldn't exist if it was only allowed to exist if it could be rationally justified. And would the world really be better If we answer no, then we can start to see why autonomous rationality can be a force of totalitarianism and violence, because it basically goes through and gets rid of everything that can be not rationally justified. Therefore, the movie Looper would be done away with, the paintings of Dali, any of the music that can't be justified with an explanation, all of that would be removed. And I think that would indeed be a form of violence against society, because great art is very, very important. It might come from a subconscious or an emotional place or an experiential place or an aesthetic place that can't be fully rationally understood but is non-rationally valid, and in fact in that non-rationality could point to truth and manifest truth in ways that rationality never can, because rationality is very linear and very limited. Again, it is rational to think that this is a cup, but that very construct does not capture the full phenomenon of cups. So rationality is always more of a simulation. It's more of a lower resolution of the fullness of life, of which is useful and necessary, so long as it remains dialectical with experience. Another way to put this, as long as you have a dialectic between rational and true, rational and non-rationality, things are well. But if you have too much of one or the other, you end up in you end up in a very deprived life. Ultimately, this is going to suggest why something like the leap of faith Kierkegaard talks about is necessary, because if we need non-rationality in life, and we can't rationally justify it, we're going to have to take some kind of leap of faith to assent to a non-rational premise that will then organize our rationality according to it in its image and likeness, but is of itself will be a very raw existential choice. So we allude to Kierkegaard here, who Mr. Fondane likes to touch on himself. What Fondane understands is that if logic and rationality conclude X, the Enlightenment would have us do X, no questions asked. But then, of course, X becomes oppressive, something we must do. But the Enlightenment would say this is kind of the key move, that the rational is good. And therefore, being forced to do the good is not bad. And that's an important concept, where if we assume the rational is best, well, then it's never immoral to force people to do the rational, because it's what's best. It's like disciplining your child to do what's best for them. This is why it's so important to understand that rational and best are not similes, because once you can separate those, you can separate the kind of moral justification that autonomous rationality grants itself in being oppressive, because it's not being oppressive to itself, it's just maybe being disciplinary, it's teaching, it's gifting, it's blessing, it's a hard love, if you will, and thus why it's so critical to understand that rational and right are not similes. Maybe, though, a reason why we like to think that autonomous rationality is possible is precisely to avoid the existentialism of Kierkegaardian leaps of faith or selecting a non-rationality. Because we can always say, if we do X, we can always say, well, I did X because it was the rational thing to do. And in a way, kind of outsource responsibility to the fabric of reality almost. It's a way to escape responsibility. But once you start accepting the premise that autonomous rationality is not possible, well, then you have to make a choice, a raw choice that comes from something deeper that's probably experiential. But if it's experiential, it's kind of based more on us and our subjectivity and our interpretation of that experience, and we become more responsible for it, and that's existentially terrifying. So there might be a psychological and existential relief that autonomous rationality can grant us, hence why it's so tempting. It brings to mind that part in Kierkegaard's Either Or, where he says, marry and you will regret it. Do not marry and you will also regret it. Marry or do not marry, you will regret it either way. Laugh at the stupidities of the world and you will regret it. Weep over them and you will also regret it. Trust a girl and you will regret it. Do not trust her and you will also regret it. Kierkegaard with the Either Or, and I really think the Either Or is a very important concept, because he's kind of getting at that when it comes to many things in life, either or. You can't really say one is rational or the other relative to what metrics. Everything has pluses and minuses. There's tragedy, trade-offs of competing goods. And that would suggest that a lot of life can be a kind of can lead you to a Burdian's donkey situation. I can never be a Burdian's donkey, where you have a donkey trapped between two equally sized piles of grain, and the donkey starves to death because it can't decide which one to eat, because it's equally rational to eat either, and Kierkegaard suggests a lot of life is like that. We have to do something non-rational and just choose one of the piles of grain, but of course that makes us existentially responsible, and we don't like that. Some more examples of the way that rationality is limited, say, by the body, by the mind, memory. I think Marcis Merleau-Ponty and the Phenomenology of Perception is a very good book. And all thinking, all rationality is embodied, right? I mean, it's in a human body. I'm not saying that other animals can't think, but if we just take the human as the example, we're always reasoning from a position in space-time, and therefore our rationality is embodied. But that fact alone actually suggests that autonomous rationality is impossible. If I'm a great distance away from a lion, let's say, I might say the lion is small. But if the lion was close, the statement the lion is small would seem crazy. Distance changes the rationality of the statement, though the truth of the lion's size remains constant, suggesting again the divide between truth and the rationality. Maybe I know that the lion is actually large and therefore know it's irrational to think that the lion is small, but that knowledge would be predicated upon memory. If I was, as a child, encountering a lion for the very first time and saw it from a distance and I didn't understand geometry, maybe like a Benji and Sound and the Fury, by William Faulkner, then it would be rational to think the lion was small. But really, that would just be a result. But that rational conclusion would be conditioned by the truth of my location in space and time and geometry and positioning and all these different things. Another way to look at this, if I was really, really close to the lion, so close that I could see its quantums and the atoms and everything that made the lion up, well, the laws and principles of physics of which applied would radically change. So because I stand far away from the lion, I would think of it as generally following Newtonian physics. But if I get super close, then suddenly I'm going to think about it maybe following quantum mechanics or quantum positioning and all those different things. So what's interesting is that, therefore, what rationality applies is relative to where we are located, our conditioning, our embodiment in space and time. So right there, you take seriously the fact that rationality is always embodied. And Pontiac, in Phenomenology of Perception, offers a lot of examples of this idea. Another way to put it is if I'm sitting here looking at a refrigerator, I could think about turning the refrigerator around all day long, and it never will turn around. In order to think about the back of the refrigerator, I'd have to get up and turn it around, and then I can think about it. Until that point, I'd have to imagine what was behind the refrigerator. So I either have to imagine the back of the refrigerator, I have to use memory to recall the back of the refrigerator, or I have to get up, stand up, walk over, and turn it around so that I can reason about it, because otherwise I'm not really observing it. Well, all of those things I just described are not exactly rationality. Imagination is not rationality, even if I can reason about what I imagine. Memory is not rationality, even if I can reason about what I remember. And action, getting up and turning the fridge around, is not rationality, even if I can rationalize about action. So right there, you see that rationality is always conditioned by the environment it is in, by the situation it's in, by the capabilities of the people of whom are doing the reasoning. If I was not strong enough to turn the fridge around, then I couldn't reason about it. I certainly couldn't reason about the empirical observation about it. I would just have to reason about what I remember about the back of the fridge or can imagine it to be like. So again, autonomous rationality is just simply not possible. The paper will also touch on Nash Equilibria, which are suboptimal results that occur when all players in a game, quote unquote, are rational. This is game theory, and in order to escape suboptimal results, you need non-rationality, and that's a topic I discussed with Lorenzo that I think Fondane talks about very, very well. Something that's also interesting to consider is another topic, but in the paper in Hegel and the ontological implications of pure thought, of what's not there, we're able to think of a contradiction. I'm able to think of things that are not real, things that don't exist. I'm able to imagine a square circle or to try to envision it, try to see it. So I'm able to think contradiction. I'm able to think mistake and error. Well, error, mistake, contradiction, these things don't correspond to anything in the world. So they're kind of pure thoughts. And there's a lot more to this idea, but the notion is, what are the ontological implications of us as human beings being capable of pure thought? What does that mean for us? Well, right there, that kind of suggests that there's something ontological about human beings that may not be purely translatable into autonomous rationality, that you may need something like non-rationality to really get. And the paper will discuss that. The possible is a significant theme in Fondane's work, where he's going to really, you could say that's kind of the big thing, him and his teacher and friend, Sestov, I think. They really want to stress the possible and scream the need for the possible, where if we don't have the possible, then we lack hope. But if rationality is all we have, then all that is possible is what is rational. And in a way, the possible loses its power because nothing is possible beyond what is rational. And so for them, that's going to lead to hopelessness. That's going to lead to an imprisonment, kind of a state where we are stuck. And that's one of the reasons why the most rational of all possible worlds could be suboptimal and hopeless, if not a form of hell, because you would be bound to the rational. You would not be able to be saved by the possible. And I mean, for them, that will get to the point of thinking of things like God is capable of changing the past. God is capable of making rocks he cannot lift, all these different things, because a God of whom is rationally bound, you could say the God of Greek philosophy versus the God of Judaism. This is a God. They really want to stress God as truly unbound by rationality, because a truly free God, because if God is not truly free, then God cannot be a source of the possible, and as a result, you're going to fall into hopelessness. So now, what exactly do they mean by the possible? And as long as, and I will stress that as long as non-rationality plays a vital, quintessential role in our thinking, well, then we can always hope in the possible, because even if we can't think it, even if we cannot put it in rational terms, that doesn't mean it cannot exist. So there's always space for the possible. It helps me understand what Fondane means by the possible, to think about the book After Finitude by Quentin M. I can never say his last name, forgive me. Quentin really supports a doctrine of radical contingency, which is this idea that things don't have a necessary reason behind them, that nothing necessarily is the way that it is. So that means, now that's interesting, because that would mean that you can't necessarily have a stable understanding of the world, because it could change at any moment. And I think this quote, this paragraph, captures Quentin's thinking very well, which, if we take seriously, would indeed suggest that non-rationality is not possible. And if we take this paragraph seriously, it does indeed suggest that autonomous rationality is not possible, and that non-rationality plays a critical role. Because if things do not have stable reason, then we have to sometimes be able to consider things outside of reasoning to really get their fullness, because reasoning can never fully capture things. It would be perhaps capable of capturing things if they had an inherent stable reason, like a telos or an essence or something. But for Quentin, that is not the case. So autonomous rationality is problematic. And even if you do believe that things have a telos or a purpose, it doesn't necessarily follow that you would be able to fully grasp that with just rationality. But we could say the Enlightenment version of the reasoning of things would suggest that you could. But that would get us into a discussion on the difference between, say, teleology from an Aristotle and, say, maybe the determinism of a Bertrand Russell or something like that. But that's a different topic. For now, this paragraph from Quentin, I think, captures his thinking quite well. Instead of construing the absence of reason inherent in everything as a limit that thought encounters in its search for the ultimate reason, we must understand that this absence of reason is and can only be the ultimate property of the entity. We must convert facticity into the real property whereby everything in every world is without reason and is thereby capable of actually becoming otherwise without reason. For the truth is that there is no reason for anything to be or to remain thus, and so, rather than otherwise. And this applies as much to the laws that govern the world as to the things of the world. Everything could actually collapse, from trees to stars, from stars to laws, from physical laws to logical laws, by virtue of the absence of any superior law capable of preserving anything, no matter what, from perishing. I think so that was from After Finitude. I think what Fondane is proposing is very similar. Nothing must be the way it is, which is to say everything is contingent and at any moment possible. If this is the case, rationality can never have the last word, for the possible could always break through and shatter whatever rationality constructs. To use theological language, if rationality works and has power, it is because it is operating within possibility's permissive will, per se. Possibility can always at any moment seize back dominion. In this way, rationality always operates within non-rationality, and thus autonomous rationality becomes an ignorant denial that everything occurs within the possible. So I think Mr. Fondane's thinking goes very well with the ontology proposed by Quinton, because if indeed radical contingency is the case, then rationality can never have the last word. Any successes of rationality are going to be within the quote-unquote permissive will of the possible. And by that I mean you have this notion that evil for God is good, so why is there evil in the world? And there's this notion, and it would have to be elaborated on, that evil occurs within God's permissive will, but it is not his divine will or his full will. He wants goodness to prevail, but evil has a role, possibly by making freedom possible, to fulfill that role. Therefore, God allows evil, so it's in its permissive will, even if it's not his divine will. Fondane is going to stress that history was made for man and not man for history, and he's playing on the Sabbath there, where Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So likewise, he wants to suggest that rationality was made for man, not man for rationality, but we basically reduce man, flatten him when we act as if autonomous rationality is the case, he really wants to stop that. And he really wants, and also too, if we take seriously the possible in non-rationality, then that brings back mystery to life, that brings back to uncertainty, unknowing, and that actually creates hope. If you knew everything and lost hope, there would be no way to get it back. In order to have hope and even meaning, and it would be an extensive topic, you need the unknown, and seeking the unknown almost by definition has to be non-rational. But if you don't seek the unknown, well, then everything you know is the case. And this will also tie into Fondane's discussion on boredom and how he thinks boredom is the natural outcome of a world that is overly rational because it knows everything. If it knows everything, there's nothing left to know, and so boredom tends to follow. Boredom is not a situation where we have nothing to do. It's a situation where we don't see significance in what we could do. And the problem, of course, becomes that rationality, in discovering everything, the risk is that nothing seems significant anymore. And so boredom and rationality go together. And then Fondane is going to warn that boredom and war and totalitarianism tends to go together. The book will also, the paper will also discuss the blank canvas, which is a paper in the Fate of Beauty that I think is relevant here. We're also going to talk about Nicholas Berdyaev. I was very pleased to see Fondane mention Berdyaev. I think The Meaning of the Creative Act is an excellent book. And an idea that Berdyaev inspired was the notion that there's a difference between causation and creation. Causation is when two billiard balls hit one another and one of them moves. Creation is when I write a novel. Now, of course, creation so for Berdyaev, creation is ex nihilo. It comes from nothing. And technically, only God can create, because only God can create out of nothing. But human beings, if we follow Genesis 1:3, have the image and likeness of God, and so can, to a degree, create, even if not fully, because we're always creating out of, say, caused things, like rocks or canvases, all of the material that we use to, say, even type on a laptop, or caused, came into existence via physical processes. But there is something creative-like. That's ex nihilo-like about creation. Now, again, that's an extensive topic to expand on that. And the paper, Through Nothing We Know, is also going to give other examples that seem very close to ex nihilo. But humans seem to have a creative capacity, not just, they're not bound purely by causation, and we can associate creativity with non-rationality and truth, while causation and rationality tend to go together. And so humans are creative beings, and Berdyaev, a good section of the paper will go into Berdyaev, and he really wants to defend the spiritual side of human beings, which is the creative side. He warns, objectification destroys life and being. And rationality, therefore, without non-rationality, destroys both. So this tendency, this desire to be objective, actually can destroy life because it it removes creativity, therefore non-rationality, therefore leads us to boredom and non-creativity, and we cease to be creative. Berdyaev will say at one point, the essential and fundamental problem is the problem of man, of his knowledge, his freedom, his creativeness. Man is the key to the mystery of knowledge and of existence. He is the enigmatic being which, though a part of nature, cannot be explained in terms of nature, and through which alone it is possible to penetrate into the heart of being. Berdyaev is a theologian as well as a philosopher, so he's going to associate spirit with non-rationality and creativity and different things. But I think we can understand what Berdyaev is getting at and see a lot of legitimacy to his arguments if we understand that spirit and non-rationality go together. I actually even think that getting that is important for understanding the thought of Alexander Dugin and Russia. As I am speaking, there is currently, unfortunately, a horrific war that is occurring in Europe with Ukraine. And I think if we really want to get the thinking of, say, Alexander Dugin, which as I understand it, Dugin is influential on Putin, although I'm no expert, I think to understand Dugin's thinking, understanding what what someone like Berdyaev means when he talks about spirit is really, really important. But I will save that for the paper on Putin, the meaning crisis, and things like that. Anyway, for Berdyaev, if human being freedom also is critical here. We're free because of non-rationality and creativity. So if we lose all that, which pure autonomous rationality can do to us, will get us in massive, massive trouble. Spirit is liberty, Berdyaev insists. But where can spirit be found? Well, Fondane is writing at a time where it seems like it can't be found anywhere because we don't allow space for the possible. We believe only in autonomous rationality. And Berdyaev says something like, in the history of the world, nothing has ever been fully realized in the true and ontological sense of the world. It's a strange claim, isn't it? So for Berdyaev, that can be linked up with the possible, that the fullness of the possible and the non-rational and the spirit and the fully free and the fully creative has never been fully expressed. And that's a source of hope. If we take it seriously, it can be a source of hope. And if Fondane is correct, that autonomous rationality leads to totalitarianism and violence, not only is it a source of hope, it's necessary to avoid the great horrors of the 20th century. Berdyaev will say also that man precedes philosophy. Man is the prerequisite of all philosophic knowledge, which we should think of as being very similar to this notion of rationality was made for man not for rationality. There is something about human beings, there is a spirit of creativity, of freedom, a non-rationality, of which cannot be fully captured by scientific knowledge. And for us to think that it can be leads to reductionism and the meaning crisis, frankly. I think thinkers like Berdyaev and Fondane saw it coming. Also, I think the vector theory from Bard and Ilung is extremely useful here, because basically what Berdyaev is saying is that there is a vector that is uniquely human that cannot be reduced to the material. And if we do so, we end up with a lot of trouble. So I think vector theory is quite useful here. Creativity is inseparable from freedom. Only he who is free creates. This is Berdyaev. Out of necessity can be born only evolution. Creativity is born of liberty. And that sounds, again, like vector theory. There is something about the vector of mind, to allude to Ilung's work, that cannot be reduced to evolutionary processes, even if it is a result of evolutionary processes. You cannot reduce Beethoven's Ninth to the instruments that play it, even if it's only possible because of those instruments. And so, likewise, if the uniquely human is this vector of mind, then the expression of mind in creativity is also the expression of liberty. And we need that freedom to escape totalitarianism, because the absence of freedom is totalitarian. Now, at the same time, the paper is going to describe how if we have freedom, but we don't have an appreciation of non-rationality, or we don't have spirit and we're not creative, well, we just end up like characters in Kafka, where we freely capture ourselves with our very rationality and end up destroyed. And this will, or imprisoned or miserable. And so this alludes to the work on Kafka in The Breaking of the Day. It's also going to mention Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, which suggests that if we have freedom, but we're still operating according to autonomous rationality, then we capture ourselves and we end up imprisoned, and we end up emergently deconstructing our own being. So it's simply not enough to just be free. We also have to meet the contingencies of spirit or non-rationality, creativity, all these different terms, in order to use that free in a manner that doesn't have us end up like Joseph K. in Kafka. And there's part of the paper will expand on that. Now, we also don't want autonomous non-rationality, which is where we never use rationality. That would lead us into a society that would be anarchy. There would not be shared intelligibility. Nature would also overwhelm us because we wouldn't have a way to figure out how to operate successfully within it. Human civilization would become impossible. Ultimately, what we need is a dialectic between non-rationality and rationality. And again, Fondane is not against rationality. He just wants to put it in its proper bounds. And for me, that means we need to put in a dialectic with non-rationality, and that's where I'm going to talk about the dialectic between the true and the rational, where they have to go together. I find it really interesting here where Fondane says, perhaps a day will come when the historian will agree to take a look at the basest forms of boredom in history. It is boredom that is the source of sudden change, of wars without reason, of deadly revolutions. There is no more effective cause than boredom. Historians will say afterward that political, economic, and social causes explain the outbursts, of course. They will, but they will not have grasped the elementary fact that people were bored. It's a funny idea that Fondane is playing with, but I actually think it's important because he wants to suggest that there are these non-rational causes for history, and actually boredom is the source of these radical non-rational, that are the source of these great violences. And this is very ironic because if he's correct that autonomous rationality causes boredom, a lot of people think it's rationality that helps you escape the horrors of history. But actually what you see here is this idea that pure rationality leads to a boredom of which then to escape people give rise. These great horrors of history occur. So there's a grand irony there that's really quite terrifying, actually, and kind of devastating, is we tend to assume that if history was rational, if the world was rational, there wouldn't be evil in it, there wouldn't be problems, there wouldn't be this violence. But actually, if rationality leads to boredom, and boredom is a cause of horror in history, then rationality will not help us escape the horrors of history. In fact, rationality will cause them. I think that's a very existentially terrifying realization, because if that means we need non-rationality to escape history, how in the world do we get that? And how in the world do we spread it to lots of people? Rationality has this lovely ability to make people conform. If we determine X is rational, then it's non-contingent, it's objective, and there's a chance of getting everyone to conform to it. But of course, the horror is that there's a chance of getting everyone to conform to it. That's totalitarian and that is oppressive. If we start to suggest that the only ways to escape history is non-rational, well, then the work we have to do is entirely different than what we thought it was, and it might be 1,000 times more difficult, and it might be inescapable from taking seriously the subject, conditionalism, personal experience, all these different things that are very complex and very difficult. Arguably, people are the most complex thing of all. And if we have to take those things into account, well, then the project we need to engage on is much more different than we may have thought it was for a very long time. Now, the work of O.G. Rose will be exploring all that, and will indeed explore how we need a dialectic between truth and rationality, and what exactly that means. But I think Mr. Fondane provides us with a very good case of why we need to open ourselves up to the possible, even though that's existentially terrifying, and opening ourselves up to that could entail having to let certain hopes and dreams we had from the Enlightenment die. Now, there might be something that our frenemy brains, doesn't like about all this, because our brains tend to like autonomous rationality because it's simple and linear. But if we want to create some motivation for the case, I think the meaning crisis is, in fact, one giant case study that verifies Berdyaev and Fondane and Hume and people like that. The meaning crisis is a screaming example of what happens when you try to run the world purely by rationality alone. It leads to mental health crises. It leads to nihilism and depression and all of these different things. And the meaning crisis is the logical outcome of autonomous rationality. In this case is made in Belonging Again and throughout the true isn't the rational. So the meaning crisis itself suggests the necessity of taking Fondane seriously. But I also will end by stressing that I think the meaning crisis is a sign of hope, in the sense of we do know how to get meaning again. We can go to xenophobia, racism, all these horrible sources of meaning that humans have used in the past. where today we're more like Thomas More refusing to give the king a divorce because of our principles and ethics, so we refuse to do that now. So the meaning crisis is the logical outcome of rationality, but if we can rise to the occasion of the meaning crisis, because history is indeed contingent and the possible is there, it is possible for our choices now to work back and change the meaning of the phases of history that may have ascribed to an autonomous rationality that was so destructive, and transform that into a step in a sort of Hegelian phenomenological journey, as Dr. Lass puts it, that is going to sublimate us into something higher. The meaning crisis can be a negative space that can be an opportunity for a truly best of all possible worlds, not just a suboptimal best of all possible worlds that is organized by autonomous rationality, if we rise to the occasion. So, if we're going to believe in the possible, then it is possible that these periods of autonomous rationality could end up being good. They can be part of the path that got us to a higher way of life that we couldn't have gotten to without going through it. It makes me think of kind of C.S. Lewis in The Great Divorce, when he talks about if you got to heaven, you'll look back and see that all your life, everything you lived was part of heaven. If you get to hell, you look back and it sees everything was part of hell. Like eternity kind of stretches back and includes finite space-time in it as well. Likewise, if we were to rise to the occasion of the meaning crisis, in history were to achieve that, it would work back in time and change the meaning of what we went through. And it wouldn't have to just be a giant, violent mistake. It could actually be part of a story that led us to something higher, because we learn from our mistakes. Sometimes mistakes can make it possible to arrive at a better life than you would have arrived at had you not made those mistakes, because you learned from those mistakes, and only from those mistakes could you have learned what you learned. Now, that's all contingent, though. That doesn't mean you should make mistakes, because, you make them and you don't rise to the occasion of those mistakes. Well, then it's a terrible mistake, and it could be an effacement. It could be devastating. So it's always contingent, and that's following Hegel. It's always contingent. So I think taking seriously the possible found in Fondane, even though he was a critic of Hegel, I think the Hegel that Fondane critiques is more of the Marxist Hegel, but that's another story. The possible, indeed, I think, suggests a Hegelian notion of history that can, based on what we choose to do today, can work back and change the meaning of what happened in the past and make it part of a good story, a story that helped us arrive at a place where we appreciate the dialectic between the true and the rational, as opposed to continue to ascribe to an autonomous rationality that kills the human spirit. So, on this day, choose life, choose creativity, choose spirit, choose to escape the temptations of autonomous rationality. Choose to face the existential anxiety of which making that choice requires, but choose it today. And to feel the imperative and to understand the necessity of making that choice. We are in debt to Mr. Benjamin Fondane. For more by David Gosley, please visit his YouTube page. For John David, please visit his YouTube page. Speaking with those gentlemen is an absolute delight, and this was a wonderful text to explore with them, and I'm always grateful for that opportunity. And for more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.